You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Monster House presents.
Monster Talk's a proud member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, home of such shows as the Daily Meditation Podcast, I Know What Scares You, and When Things Go Wrong. If you'd like to advertise on this show, contact sales at advertisecast.com. I find burial practices fascinating. If you haven't traveled the world or haven't read about them, you might be tempted to think that they're all about the same, but no. From vaults and mausoleums to urns to sky burials to tombs, the number of ways in which humans have chosen to preserve the memory of the dead is a panoply of approaches, sometimes focused on remembering the individual as a departed loved one, and other times and places on preservation of the corpse as almost a half-deity to be supplicated. Some cultures have duties that are due the dead, and some religions hold that the dead are just empty containers and less important than the souls that once inhabited them. But there is an almost universal cultural fear around the places where we store the remains of our dead. You're listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters, which I'm betting means you're not one of the normal ones. I bet a good chunk of our listeners, like your hosts, not only aren't afraid of graveyards, but find them fascinating places to visit by day and by night. Some cemeteries, like Highgate in London or Père Lachaise in Paris, are shaded cities of the dead with their own streets and a distinct atmosphere of decaying beauty. These places have as many stories as they have bones. But sometimes in our travels, we find small, neglected cemeteries with rusted gates and tall weeds where flowers might adorn a more frequently visited plot. And these places also collect stories. And out on the high plains of Colorado, one such place is Silver Cliff Cemetery. Now, they say that people have been seeing ghost lights there since the silver rush of the 1880s. They say, even on a cloudy night, you can see the blue flames hopping around between the old monuments. It's too good of a story to not have a look, right? Well, my co-host Karen and her husband Matt went to have a look. You might be surprised to hear that even though they're very skeptical people, they saw them too.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
We're going to hop right into our chat with Karen and regular guest Matt Baxter, but I wanted to front load by saying Karen has a new book out. I've put a link to it in the show notes. It's all about the history of the word bitch, and looks to be the sort of fun book that's both a fascinating history of a word, a topic that's near and dear to word lovers, and also an amusingly rude kind of title that makes for a fun read in public places. So check the show notes for a link to bitch, and also to a book where some of tonight's research is explained in detail, one of my favorite books Karen's written, and that is Haunting America. I think you'll enjoy both of those.
Monster Talk.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Karen. Welcome back to Monster Talk. It's another week, another exciting talk about strange and paranormal adjacent and monster adjacent and monsters.
Hey.
I was looking for, for what we would be talking about this week, and I realized somehow, and I don't know how we did this, we seem to have talked about this investigation you guys did on this cemetery several times on YouTube, but I don't think we've actually done a thorough episode about your investigation. And this is work that you did, which showed up in Haunting America, and it's really interesting.
Yes.
It has weird parallels to one of my first cases I ever did with other people and skepticism.
Yeah.
And so it's like this is great. So let's talk about the Silver Cliff Cemetery in your investigation. And I hope, if you don't mind, could we start out with sort of talking about why it's spooky? What's the legend? Like, what is this? Where is it? And what's it all about?
There's a lot to unpack here. And this is a story, it's really one of those ones that keeps coming up again and again. Just when you think, okay, well, we have the answer to this, we've debunked this, we've got the solution to the claims, it just seems to resurface. And it's almost as though that information, the truth isn't out there. So Silver Cliff Cemetery, we're in Colorado, and Matt and I have continued to hear about this little cemetery. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. I guess it's where is it, Matt? Probably about 3 hours drive from Denver.
Yeah, approximately, I would say. South.
So it's right next to this town called Westcliff, and it's purported to have the country's most haunted, if not the world's most haunted cemetery. So when I think about cemeteries, I tend to think about those big ones like maybe St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, the one that Marie Laveau would frequent. I think about places like Resurrection Cemetery in Chicago as well, and Hollywood Cemetery in LA with the ghosts of celebrities and things like that. So I was a little mystified as to why this place had this reputation for being so haunted. And so Matt and I became very interested in this topic and really did a investigation that took quite some time. This goes back 10, 11 years now. And we went to this place, and we went in different climates, different seasons as well, so that we could really try to figure out what was going on there. Ultimately, the answer, the solution was right in front of us. But it was an interesting tale just to get to that point. So, Matt, do you want to begin by telling everyone a little bit about the stories that have taken place surrounding this cemetery?
Well, like Karen said, it's near a town called Westcliff, which actually is a sister town to a town called Silver Cliff. They're right next to each other. They're practically the same town. But the reason one is called Silver Cliff is because there was an amazing silver mining rush there back in the late 1800s. And that's when supposedly the legend started, when people started getting buried in the cemetery around that time in the 1880s, that there were these strange sort of floating blue lights. And they thought that they were like lanterns, from inside the mines that someone was carrying. But it became very creepy. And it's like, you've kind of got these old tales of these lights out in the cemetery. And then, we hear in this day and age, we hear that National Geographic actually went out and did an investigation out there. And they saw them. In their investigation, they saw the lights. They proved that they were there. And, it's in an issue of National Geographic, August 1969. So how can you argue with that? I mean, that's a great place to start, with oh, this must be real. Just happens to turn out that, it wasn't an investigation.
The stories that are coming out of the cemetery really change over the years. So as Matt said, originally you've got the idea of this, a bright light, maybe a blue light typically, or a white light, through to multicolored lights, red lights and green lights and lights that bounce around the cemetery. A lot of stories seem to resemble tales of will-o'-the-wisps and spook lights. So you really have a lot of folklore that's intersecting with this story and feeding into it. And as Matt said, claims that maybe these lights came from miners, or there was a young girl who was buried in the cemetery, and the lights are coming from her somehow. So all of these different stories, but
So
there's
miners
this-
and miners.
Exactly.
miners, both kind. And ultimately, we're told, well, this has been researched, this has been investigated by none other than National Geographic. So obviously, this is factual. This is true. Something strange is going on here. So what's interesting is that the New York Times had actually covered the case a few years before National Geographic. People do talk about that as well. There's just a little article, and I've got a clipping that I'll read out from the New York Times. The legends say that the dancing lights were first seen in the pre-dawn hours of a bitter winter day in 1880. A small group of miners were returning to Silver Cliff after a rip-roaring party in the nearby mining town of Rosita. They were still a bit unsteady of foot after the festivities and were laughing as they recalled the raucous highlights of the dance hall social. Their route back to Silver Cliff took them past the old cemetery, and here, as they passed the place, one of the miners stopped, grasped the arm of a companion and pointed into the burial ground. There, flickering on the carved surface of a freshly raised tombstone, was a blue flame. The miners stared with fascination for a very short while, and with less stagger and more speed, headed quickly for nearby Silver Cliff. So, yeah, we have that story, and then that's followed by the story in National Geographic. So you have this idea of it being, I don't know, maybe a long-form piece or a research piece. And National Geographic don't really do those kinds of scholarly investigations. But the information on Silver Cliff is a lot shorter than we're led to believe. And it's just this little postscript, really.
So do you remember when we were talking about the most haunted cities and there was one that was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records, and we looked and it was just like a
Yes.
like a little paragraph blurb thing. It was like, it was completely not.
Well, this is
yeah.
two paragraphs.
Yeah, there you go.
But still,
it just reminds me.
hardly some kind of investigation or academic paper or anything like that. Just a footnote, really, in an article called Colorado, the Rockies Pot of Gold by Edward Lynham in August 1969, as Matt said. So I'll read the little section because it's not that long. Eerie lights await explanation. I recall quite vividly the last such town I visited before leaving Colorado, a place called Silver Cliff in the wet mountain valley west of Pueblo. Today it counts about 110 year-round residents where once 5,000 lived. Be sure to get there after dark, a fellow camper from Kansas had told me, and drive out to the old cemetery. You'll see something mighty strange. We'd bounced about a mile out of Silver Cliff across pitch-black prairie when Bill Klein, who runs the local campground, told me to pull up and switch my headlights off. Do you believe it? I asked him. About the lights in the graveyard? I've seen plenty of them. This is a good night for them. Overcast, no moon. We climbed out beside the old burying ground, and for long minutes I strained to see something, anything. Slowly, vague outlines of grave markers emerged in ragged rows. There. Bill's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. And over there. I saw them too. Dim, round spots of blue-white light glowed ethereally among the graves. I found another and stepped forward for a better look. They vanished. For 15 minutes we walked about the place, pursuing one will-o'-the-wisp, then another. I aimed my flashlight at one eerie glow and switched it on. It revealed only a tombstone. Again, that's not any kind of in-depth investigation. It's just a footnote and really just recounting the folklore. And so I think that it kind of gives us a hint at what's going on as well. They're talking about these lights in the cemetery and what happens right at the end. The fellow aims his flashlight at one of these glows and there's a tombstone. So I think if we want to talk about spoilers, that really spoils what's going on.
That one is quite a spoiler and anchored right there at such an early date. Yeah, exactly.
It is, and even though they say eerie lights await explanation. So then we go back to a Skeptical Inquirer piece, and I don't have it handy, but I think it goes back to maybe the 1980s or 1990s. And the fellow who writes the article does come up with the solution for what's going on here, that it's reflections of lights on tombstones. But again, the source of what's going on is right in front of us, even though so many articles have come out, no one's been able to figure out what exactly was going on. Well, they figured out what's going on, but they haven't found out that the source tells us what was really happening. But you've got other scientific theories out there too. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit to some of those, like fireflies and phosphorescence?
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of different theories and scientific things that could be happening. I mean, there's lots of reasons that you could see something phosphorescent out there, such as decaying wood sometimes can become phosphorescent.
From old crosses.
Foxfire. Yeah.
And it's, there's lots of different possibilities. None of them, I think, would be consistent.
Well, there you go. But maybe it doesn't need to be, right?
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't. You only need one person to see one thing at one time for it to be for all time.
Even with the explanation that we have, though, it could truly be different people seeing different things. So even though we know what happened, it's possible that at other times other people saw different things. That's a really good point.
Absolutely. And the thing is, Karen and I, we did go out there 3 different times, and just to try to really figure out what people were seeing.
Because we're not well.
We're not well.
To devote this much time to it.
Yeah. One time was in the dead of winter, and it was very cold and
snowing and icy and miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, it really was.
We camped out to see the lights.
Yeah. and we saw them.
Did you sleep in the cemetery or outside the cemetery?
We didn't sleep.
Oh, I see. Well, that's hot. Anyway, the point is,
it was really interesting though, because we were really watching for any possibility, and that particular night, it wasn't overcast. It was just freezing. We did see the lights. We went up there in the summertime, and we did catch some overcast, so we couldn't blame the stars for reflecting off of the headstones. And that we still could see them.
There's another theory, too, that we haven't touched upon, that some people will say, it's something called prisoner's cinema. So people are in solitary confinement, or maybe in a cave or something like that. You're in a
sensory deprivation situation. Yeah.
Yes.
It is, yes.
Yeah, and almost akin to sneezing and when you see stars and bright lights. But people certainly go out to Silvercliff to this day trying to see something. And on a night where there are very few stars or there's no light, you could very easily fool yourself into thinking that you're seeing something.
Well, the key words there is trying to see something. So it is pretty easy to see something out there if you're really trying. And the sensory deprivation aspect of it can happen very easily. The whole thing about it is when you're having a sensory deprivation sort of experience and you're out there in the dark, there's a certain look to it. And you can kind of tell that, oh, this is not real. This is, my eyes are playing with me because I'm in the dark. But, if you're really needing to kind of, play into your own bias, then you can ignore those obvious things. But that's still not it. That's still not what was causing the lights that we were seeing. We were seeing, really what those old miners saw, I'm sure. Which is another interesting thing, because we can't find any mention of any of these stories about these old miners before this little bit of information we found in a history museum down in the basement in the microfiche area.
And that was the interesting thing, that you have these reports that allegedly go back to the 1880s. So we kept hearing about these periods of time that were being mentioned. We'd hear about the 1880s, and then we'd read a lot about the 1920s. So either miners in the 1880s or miners or party goers in the 1920s. But there were also a number of specific references too that would talk about 1956. So it was kind of interesting that you have these other vague dates, 1880s, 1920s, and then suddenly people talking about maybe April 1956 or around that time frame. And that just seemed so specific that we thought, well, we should really look into this. Maybe there's something to be found here. So we went to History Colorado, I guess, what would you call it, Matt, a kind of archives place and a museum.
Yeah, it's a museum, and then, of course, the basement is where they have all these things archived.
We went there on, speaking of cold and snow, it was just a very icy, snowy day. I think a blizzard was taking place.
It was a blizzard, yes. Yeah.
And so we went down there early in the morning and asked to use the microfiche, and went looking for there had been a number of newspapers in the area around that time. And some of them have just gone bust and over time. But one that fit the bill for being published in that area and that would have been relevant to that time was a newspaper called the Wet Mountain Tribune. So we brought up copies of that for 1956 and for 1955, I think 56 and 57, so we could look around that whole time frame. And it was so interesting to just go through these old newspapers, and Blake, I know you love this kind of thing.
All
too.
I was thinking was I would love to go on a microfishing trip for the weekend. That would
yeah. But
it was so much fun. I have to say, I was totally role playing when I'm there, being the detective, in this very special episode, of an old 70s, police show. And I was just having a great time. And I looked over at Karen, and the expression on her face shocked me because she clearly found it.
Yeah,
the smoking
nice.
gun.
What a great feeling that is, though. Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, we're going through all these old trite stories about, Mr. and Mrs. Smith drove through the area, and this was their second visit, and just like these really kind of simple, basic stories about locals and visitors to the town, and just the things that were interesting at that point seemed quite dull in comparison to today. But yeah, we came across the article, so it was dated April 13th, 1956, and I'm hoping, Matt, you can read the snippets of this story. It's called Silver Cliff Cemetery Ghosts Carrying Own Lights at Night.
Well, and that headline is
everything
just
away.
I love the headline.
So clickbait. I can't believe they're going for 1956.
For 1956, for
yes,
sure.
It was a very, very early version of clickbait. But yeah, because one of the other headlines right next to it is Fire Threatens Local Ranch Residents. So I will do my best to read this without stumbling too much because the print is small.
Tiny.
But I'll do my best. Curious clusterites flock to burial ground to view unusual reflections. Traffic to the Silver Cliff Cemetery has increased at least 1,000% during the past week, but there is no cause for alarm, or is there? At least the traffic increase is not due to an increase in the local death rate, although some of those who have made the trip to the cemetery have expressed themselves as scared to death. It seems that one evening last week, some of the younger set of the community were taking a nocturnal ride, which carried them past the cemetery. As they passed the cemetery, screams of terror came from the feminine occupants of the car, as they beheld numerous eerie lights dancing about among the tombstones. The following day, tales of the ghostly lights were spreading rapidly through the community, and numerous were the curious ones who trekked to the cemetery during the nights that followed. There were those who trembled with the terror as they saw the bluish lights twinkling here and there in the burial ground. Many strong men refused to leave the sanctuary of their cars, and many frightened women would take but one look. I'm going to skip down here a little bit so we can get to the spoilers. Theories as to the reason for the lights, they're still there if you want to see them, are numerous. Some advanced the theory that some mischievous youngsters had put luminous paint on the tombstones, but close examination proved that this was not true. Others said that it must be the reflection of the stars on the tombstones, but the lights are there on a cloudy night, so that theory goes awry. The most logical explanation, concurred in by many, is that the weird lights are reflections of the street lights of Westcliff, which casts a bluish tinge and would reflect thus on the tombstones of Silvercliff Cemetery, even though they are over a mile away. At least the ghostly lights have provided unusual entertainment for many Custerites. Yeah, so, in the very first reference to the ghosts of Silvercliff Cemetery has the solution in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it should have been a one and
before.
done, should have been one and done.
Doesn't date back to the 1920s or the 1880s. It's 1956. It was probably spotted by other people before that as well, independently. But certainly the urban legend as it's spread today dates back to that article.
Exactly. This is classic folklore where you have a modern story and people will invent or find just the most tenuous connections to previous stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to give it a historical anchor.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I think it's worth mentioning how compelling this illusion, or it's not really an illusion, this effect of lights reflecting off of tombstones at night can be. I mean, again, one of my earliest cases working with other people was working with Kylie Sturgis on a cemetery in Australia, and it was the exact same thing. Ghost hunters had gone into the cemetery and they'd videotaped what looked like weird lights flying around. And it really did.
Right.
It looked like that. But, I slowed it down frame by frame and stabilized it. And it became, as soon as I did that, it was obvious what they really were doing. The camera was moving and the light from the camera was reflecting off the tombstone. And it really was quite eerie in without stabilizing it. And then it's something worth seeing. I mean, if our listeners happen to be in the area or locals, I'm sure they would know about it then. But if you get the opportunity to go and check it out, and I'm sure it's a phenomenon that, as you say, Blake, occurs in lots of other cemeteries. And I think just that association with it being a cemetery and you're full of bodies and everything attached with that, all of those associations, it is just a very eerie experience. So is the church, is there a church adjacent to the cemetery? Is it still an active thing, or is it just like a historically sort of defunct graveyard?
There's no church there, but it is an active graveyard still. The problem is there's just not much money coming into it, so it's a bit derelict at times. They don't have anyone that they can pay to be a caretaker out there. So unfortunately, it can live up to its reputation as being a creepy place.
Yeah.
But the thing is you've got this story in the newspaper, and they're saying that there's all sorts of theories that people are arguing about. So when that happens, people tend to make up stories just to win arguments. and one of those is that a judge had organized it so everybody in both Silvercliff and Westcliff shut off their lights one night for a particular amount of time, and they went out and they could still see the lights in the cemetery. And I'm thinking, at this time in history, how did he organize that?
Well, I'm wondering how he could have prevented out-of-towners from driving through, or
with their headlights,
any other sources of lights, or stars.
But they would have had to shut off the city lights, all the street lights and everything, and then in people's homes, and how did everybody get notified? And it doesn't make sense to me. And plus, a great way to notify people would have been in the newspaper to say we're organizing this, but there's nothing in any of the newspapers. So we don't think this judge did not do
that. Would have been too difficult to orchestrate. But again, that's part of the lore, and it's just fascinating that I feel like we busted the story open. Yeah, and I was a little irritated to discover a couple of years ago that someone that we'd worked with in the past had basically taken all of our research, all of our findings as his own, and said that he had done the work. He had uncovered all of this, which just isn't the case. But regardless, people haven't really paid attention to, to what we've come up with, and the debunking. The story is still out there. There are tons of videos on YouTube of people going out there and scaring themselves. But it's really interesting to see how the folklore has morphed over the years. So nowadays, the current story is people in the past, again, would talk about fairy lights or spook lights or will-o'-the-wisp or ghosts and other things like that. Well, nowadays, they're orbs.
I thought orbs was going to be one of those weird things that rose up, and then everybody had sort of agreed, no, that's just dust, and then they'd go away. And
God, no.
And then no, people are like, yeah, well, most orbs are just dust, but then some of them have faces, and those are the real ones. And I'm like, really?
Yeah. Oh, I love that logic. Yeah, but we've certainly heard things like that, haven't we, Matt?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the other problems is people get their information from seeing orbs on a video where there's actual movement. Now, the thing is the orbs or dust can change direction very quickly.
Yeah.
Because of the little micro air currents that we create from moving our hand, gesturing. Dust moves.
Breathing, talking.
Yeah, exactly. Anything we do. I did an interesting experiment where I filled a room with a machine fog, and then videotaped how it would react as I just made tiny little movements. Yeah. And it's quite maddening to see all the different, swirls and everything else that happen. And if you got just one dust particle that happens to be reflecting back to the camera, it looks like it's just dancing and doing all kinds of amazing things that a dust particle could never do. So it's got to be a ghost. So, the bringing video into the whole orb argument really dirties things up.
But it's just interesting to see the evolution of the story anyway, that it's still around. And it's really surprising how many people flock to this cemetery. I mean, people all around the state, all around the country, all around the globe. When we were there, we met people from Europe and people from Asia, just people from all different kinds of places and all different backgrounds who were drawn to the place. And it's just amazing how far and wide this story has spread.
Yeah. But it is interesting that, you get a cemetery full of dead people, but these legends refuse to stay buried. I mean, they won't. They just keep rising up again and again.
Yeah.
They have a lot more undead qualities than the corpses, right? They just keep rising from the grave again and again. You offer a solution for people who want it, and I imagine most people don't, because we're terrible fun ruiners, but I like knowing what's really going on.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, me too. And it was really fun to piece this together and go out and to experience it in different climates, different times of year. And it's the kind of thing that people like us do, really pig-headed and determined to get to the bottom of these things. And so it was just so exciting to find that answer, that solution. But no, it hasn't really changed anything.
No, but it is so glorious to find those smoking guns when you can. It's so good. It's so good.
It really was. Yeah. It's just a good feeling of satisfaction that we'd done our job well. And anyway, so it's just nice to know that the information's out there, as you say, if you want it.
We have no air conditioning right now. It's in the 90s outside. We've been sleeping on the floor just trying to stay cool. And to imagine being on a snowy field on a cold night in Colorado, I would have some coffee and looking for ghost lights. This sounds glorious to me right now. Absolutely glorious.
Yeah.
Yes, this is the reason we brought this up. Because we knew you were suffering.
It makes me so happy.
Yeah, like watching one of those videos on YouTube of rain.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, we would love. My yard is
cooling effect psychologically.
My yard's gone from green to beige for real. Like, we haven't had rain in a while, so it's bad. But hey, thank you for sharing this. And
thank you for resurrecting this again. But it is just one of those perennial stories. It's always out there. But I would like to mention something else, and that is that when this show comes out, that my latest book will have come out as well.
Oh, what's that book called?
His birthday is tomorrow. Bitch, The Journey of a Word.
Beep it out. What?
How dare you?
leave it in for the patrons.
That's right.
But that's
Your book is called
coming out
Really?
tomorrow.
Okay. That's
so
fantastic.
I hope that our listeners who are interested in the history and the folklore and popular culture of this word will run out and grab a copy.
People have been hounding you to know when it was coming out. And
I see what you did.
Female hounding.
all right. Well, now their mystery is curtailed. All right. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing this story and the research. I'll put some.
Thank
It's
you.
okay to use these photos in the show notes?
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. All right. Well, okay. So if you happen to find yourself out in this particular cemetery and see lights, don't be afraid. Just tune in. Remind yourself it's just on reflection. It's not that dangerous.
And on that note, we'll be back soon.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard Karen Stolzno and Matt Baxter tell the story of the Silver Cliff Cemetery lights and how they uncovered the illuminating history behind that story. Check out the show notes for links for more details about this case and a link to Karen's book, Haunting America, which has a chapter about solving this mystery. And there's also a link in the show notes to Karen's very latest book, Bitch, The Journey of a Word. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Monster Talk. Each episode, we strive to bring you the very best in monster-related content with a focus on bringing scientific skepticism into the conversation. If you enjoy Monster Talk, we now have a variety of ways to support the show, all with convenient links at monstertalk.org/support. That's monstertalk.org/support. We have links there to our Patreon page as well as a donation button. Another great way to support the show is to buy books from our Amazon Monster Talk wish list, which directly helps us with our research. We love used books very much, so don't feel compelled to buy new ones, and we love Kindle so we can share our digital libraries with each other. And finally, without spending any money at all, you can support us by leaving a positive review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Positive reviews help keep us visible in iTunes, which is a great way to help us find new listeners. And please share our show on your favorite social media platforms. Monster Talk theme music is by Peach Stealing Monkeys. To steal a line from Stephen Fry, if you have been, thanks for listening.
This has been a Monster House presentation.